Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Father Gilbert Martinez, and we welcome those here present, but certainly those online watching us from New York and other places. The people who kept up with that. So, welcome on our channel, our YouTube channel, St. Paul the Apostle Media. I was going to do an introduction of Brett by reading his biography from this book, Immigration and Faith, but it doesn't say anything. Brett, partly because I know Brett so well. We've been friends for a long time, and it's such a pleasure to have him here to speak about something that's so close to his heart and my heart. And this book, Immigration and Faith, narrative stories that kind of open it up for us. So this evening, he's going to kind of walk us through the book, and we'll have a chance for some questions online. Here in person, but when you do ask a question, please let me get you the microphone so that people can hear it online. Also, if you are online and would have questions, please in the comments section, just write them down, and we'll take care of that. So, Brett is assistant professor at Loyola Marymount University in pastoral theology. So, we're so happy to have him here at St. Paul's. Brett Hoover.
Thank you. I think I am allowed to unmask as long as I stay up here. Pardon me, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, good. Thank you to Father Gil for inviting me, and to Paulus Press for helping me bring this book to birth. My wife's here too, so thank you, Jenna. I think I want to say a few things about the genesis of this book, if that's all right. In some ways, it was born as a practical book. I teach both undergraduates and graduate students, as well as do a lot of church presentations. And I found that a lot of the resources I wanted to use were either too academic, like written really for professors, or they were what I say is not religious enough for me, like not enough reference to the Christian tradition, more pragmatic, or they were not really rooted in the realities of migration, sociologically, historically, and in terms of immigration law, which I want to say a little bit about tonight. So I did what professors do. I decided I would write my own book to satisfy these things. But as Gil said, personally too, I can remember very clearly when I was doing research in a parish that I was studying about 10 years ago, and I was having dinner with a family of people who were immigrants. The parents were immigrants. The children were born in the U.S., and they were also an undocumented family. And I had just in the car on the radio heard a series of terrible things said about undocumented immigrants. And then I sat down with this family to eat, and they were very involved pastoral leaders and Eucharistic ministers at the parish. They had stable jobs, lived in a house, had 2 kids, and they were funny even about their own misfortunes. As I mentioned at one point in the book, the father said to me one day, well, Dr. Hoover, the only papers in this house are in the bathroom. So he could even make jokes about the difficulties and tragedy of his situation. And I saw this incredible disconnect between this portrayal and stereotype of an undocumented immigrant and the people that I associated with and knew and called friends. And I thought, I have to do something about this. But that wasn't the only scene that comes to mind when I think about my personal connection. I also think about a doctor that I knew in New York City who was an immigrant from India. And people have all kinds of ideas about why professionals like doctors or engineers come to the U.S. And they usually assume that they're doing it out of a desire to make more money or something like that. And when I talked to my friend who was a doctor about why he came one day, he told me, well, in India, to do what I really want to do, which is teach in a medical school, you have to have connections and I did not grow up in a family with connections. And so I think with migration, and there's so many stories behind it, and so much reality that gets passed over in the rhetoric that we hear from politicians or on the radio and the media. And so this was my own little attempt to try to do something about it. And I like this book. You might be surprised to learn that authors don't always love the books they write. But this one, I feel like I did something that needed to be done, was different from what other people had done. So I'm happy with that, and I hope you are too. So tonight I want to kind of say a couple of things before we get into a conversation. I want to talk about a few facts about migration, and I'm going to explain why I'm using the term migration rather than immigration. I'm going to share a few stories, and then get on to the business of immigration and faith, which of course is the title of the book. And I'm saying migration rather than immigration because immigration is a specific term for people coming from outside the country, into a new country. But migration covers all kinds of the movement of peoples. The word immigration highlights the perspective of a receiving country, right? It's not about the immigrants so much as it about whether we like having immigrants or not. Whereas migration allows us to imagine the perspective of the people from the sending countries where the immigrants came from, or the perspectives of the migrants themselves. And that is really important because sometimes in the rhetoric we hear about migration, we hear only the receiving country perspective. So anyway, I have actually a quiz. It's a short quiz. But can you see that? Are you all here? Maybe not in the back. But this is a true or false quiz. So I think there's just a few of us here, but a lot of folks online. But maybe you can raise your hand when I say true or false if what you think about this is true, okay? So coming to the US, in the last 10 years, the unauthorized, which is the technical term, or undocumented, population of the United States has increased. How many people here think that's true? How many people think it's false? The false ones have it. So it is not true. The undocumented population of the United States in the last decade has actually dropped by 1.5 million. Okay, before recent waves of immigrants, few immigrants ever went home because of the great distances. How many people say true? How many people say false? Again, the false, now they're not all false, I have to tell you. But the false people are true. So as a matter of fact, half of all the Italian immigrants who came in the early 20th century went home. About half. Irish immigrants sent millions of dollars back to Ireland just like today's immigrants. True? How about false? True. They did, in fact. And legal matters, there was no such thing as illegal immigration before 1924. How many people say true? How many people say false? How many people have no idea? It's actually true. Yeah, this was a product of the 1924 Immigration Act. Before that, people were they were screened for immigration at the port of embarkation. So nobody ever made it. If you made it, you made it. U.S. citizens are 5 times more likely to go to prison than immigrants. True? Yes, it's true. It is true. It makes sense, right? You spend a lot of effort and time to come to this country. What you're going to focus on is working. An adult child of a U.S. citizen can wait as long as 14 to 21 years to get a visa to come to the U.S. How many people say true? You are correct. It is true. And I'm going to say why a little bit later on. Undocumented or unauthorized immigrants today receive more government benefits than they pay in taxes. What do you think? False? How many people say false? Yeah, you're right. Yeah, at least by most measures. Undocumented immigrants cannot get public assistance for themselves. True? True? It is true. And they can for their children that are born in the US, however. Several criminal gangs in Los Angeles today have their origins in Latin America. How many people say true? This is a brilliant audience. It's false. It's the other way around. Most of the criminal gangs in Latin America have their roots in Los Angeles. And were sent there by deportation procedures. So anyway, I like to do this in class. I actually have a much larger one that I do in class, and if you want later on, you can capture me and ask those questions or text them online. But I want to say a few facts about migration, some in addition to the ones we just discussed. One is that migration is common, right? About 3.5% of the current population of the world has migrated, 1 out of every 29 people from one country to another. And about 10% of the world has migrated within national borders, internal migration. But you still see that most people do not migrate, right? Most people in the world do not migrate. People migrate in multiple directions. So once when I was in the city of Guadalajara in Mexico studying Spanish, I asked a guy for directions, in Spanish of course, because I was in Mexico, and he said to me, "Don't talk to me in Spanish, I'm an American." And I was like, okay. Of course what I was thinking was like, dude, we're in Mexico. But there are, by some figures of the Mexican government, there are over 1 million Americans living in Mexico. So we think about Mexicans migrating to the US, but we don't think sometimes about Americans migrating to Mexico, but it happens. In fact, my former chiropractor now lives in Mexico. But another kind of thing that's important, so migration goes in all directions. The most common migration in the world is not from Latin America to the United States, it's from one Asian country to another, which makes sense. There's a lot of people in Asia, right? Another fact that I think is important is that, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention this. This is a migrant shelter in Tijuana, in TJ, and when I said about the undocumented population going down, one of the consequences of that at this shelter is that they mostly do not shelter people who are migrants who want to come to the United States. They mostly sheltered people who are deported, who are going in the other direction. But anyway, another kind of fact that I think is important is many people who want to migrate can't. And the reason for that is the law. Because there are basically mainly 2 ways that people get a permanent visa or a green card to come to the United States. It's either family reunification or special work skills, right? And none of those work skills are tied to the kinds of jobs that are mostly being produced now in the United States. They are tied to professional jobs, doctors, engineers, nurses. And also, there are limits on all these visas. There is only so many that can be given out a year. Now, there's also refugees and asylees. The difference between refugees and asylees is that asylees are people that show up here in the US, and refugees are people that apply from afar. And then there's a few other kinds of visas, but it's a very small number. So most people in the world are actually not eligible to emigrate to the United States. And the other problem is that, especially for the family reunification and professional visa applications, no one country is allowed to have more than 7% of the visas, and they are, there's quotas. So what that means is if you're from a country where a lot of people want to come to the United States, it's very, very hard to get a visa. That's why people can wait 7, 15, 14, 21 years for an adult child, for example, to get a visa. And for the countries where that's most likely to happen are Mexico, China, the Philippines, and India. So anyway, that's the kind of last fact I have about migration is that there's this popular presumption that people assimilate to American culture. But the truth is, people assimilate to a segment of American culture. Because American culture is huge and diverse, and it actually involves a lot of cultures, right? So for example, when I used to work in New York City, in Harlem, there were a lot of Dominican immigrants who were dark-skinned people from the Dominican Republic. When their children assimilated, they assimilated into African American culture, because that's how people treated them, and that's who they were around in Harlem. My colleague, who is an immigrant from Great Britain, English, when he came here, he began to assimilate to the white middle-class culture of Los Angeles. Of course, that's who he looks like, that's who people think of when they see him. People from Mexico assimilate into Mexican-American culture. And even internal migrants, like my parents, who came to California more than, I guess, about 60 years ago from Indiana, they also immigrated to California culture. And if you don't think so, meet my parents and then meet their relatives in Indiana. My mother can use words that are never spoken in Indiana, like vibe or I like your energy, you know, the kind of things we say all the time. And she hates the snow. Okay, so this is some facts, but I wanted to kind of back up a little bit and talk about the stories. And not the individual stories like I mentioned at the beginning, but the kind of cultural stories that are in the air, they're in the rhetoric of politicians, they're part of the media, but they're also just talked about by you and your neighbor. The expected kind of narratives about what migration is supposed to look like. And I think this is really important. Well, maybe I should just stop and say, even for the few of us who are here, what kind of story, when people talk about how migration is supposed to work, what kind of stories do they tell? What do they, like, for example, what do they say when they say, trying to explain why people migrate? Anybody want to give it a shot? Maybe not. Go ahead. Uh-huh. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Okay, yeah. Kind of. Okay. So that you kind of see that on the one hand, there's like this adventure narrative that he was talking about, but on the other hand, there was a little bit of let's get out of here before things get really bad. Yeah, which is also a very common narrative. Anybody else want to take a shot at this? It's kind of a big space, I know. So, in my research, I found that in receiving communities, that is, in the people who welcome immigrants or don't welcome them, there are probably 3 narratives that are really influential today. And my guess is you already know what they are. The first one is this: people are searching for a better life, right? Have you heard people talk about that? Yeah. The second one is immigrants are a threat to citizens. I'm sure you haven't heard anything like this, especially from any particular former presidents, right? And that the law sort of divides good immigrants from bad immigrants. That people who come, quote-unquote, legally are good immigrants, and people who come in violation of the law are bad immigrants, right? That's another narrative that we hear. And you want to read the book to get the whole story, but basically, I would say that all 3 of these narratives are actually wrong. So now, obviously, the data doesn't back up the threat narrative very well at all. In terms of net benefits, economically, culturally, other ways, immigrants are a tremendous benefit to our society, hardly a threat at all. And can you imagine a world without immigrants in the United States? Like, can you imagine the technologies we would not have? We wouldn't have Google. Can you imagine the medical advances, the music, the literature we would not have if we did not have immigrants? Even the rule of law thing doesn't hold up very well. So it doesn't fit the facts that, and in fact, one of the ironies of the rule of law narrative is that actually when you look at the data, the immigration of unauthorized or illegal immigrants is actually much better for the society than it is for those immigrants. They have a lot harder time. But the economic benefits that they bring, the service jobs they work, the slots they fill in the economy are awfully good for the people that receive them. So this is one of the ironies that people say, well, this is bad for citizens, but it's actually good for citizens and not as good for the unauthorized immigrants. The other thing about even the searching for a better life narrative isn't entirely accurate. Because some people do get a better life, but some people don't. And some people get a better life, most people get a better life in the second generation, but then sometimes it stops at the third or fourth generation. And for generations through the 19th century and into the early 20th century, there was almost no connection between immigration and social mobility. That is mostly a product of the post-war world where social mobility was available to a lot more people. Right? So it's not necessarily true. And if you ask immigrants, rather than the receiving community, what the story about migration is, one of the things I'm not going to explain it right now because I want to leave you something to read about, but is that people will often talk about it less in terms of a better life, like this, I came here to live in a much better world so my children would have a much better world, than it is like they made a calculation as a family. It's going to be a better deal for us. Like we're going to have a marginally better existence in this way, or that way. Like the doctor I was talking about, I can work in a medical school in the United States, a very specific thing. I can pursue the education I couldn't get. Some of my friends who are theologians, as a woman, I can't be a theologian in this country or that country, but here I can. So it's kind of a better deal in a specific area as opposed to a romanticized better life. I'm saying too much about the book. But in the thing is that these cultural narratives don't work out as well. But they are also the receiving community's cultural narratives. If you want to see the immigrants' cultural narratives, read the book, and you'll find that they're a little bit different. And I also talk a little bit about the sending countries who have their own cultural narratives about migration. Some very positive, some very negative. So anyway, let's go on to immigration and faith. Oop. Or maybe not. Oh, excuse me. So in the book, I start talking about immigration and faith. And when I teach this with undergraduates, you may not at all be surprised to learn that a lot of the students are very surprised when they learn about the way that different religious traditions talk about migration. I think a lot of the undergraduate students I teach, they presume that the church is mostly against people. And I think they're taking some of that from their perceptions of the church's positions in opposition to LGBTQ folks. But they just presume that if somebody is marginalized, then the church must be against them. But the immigration and faith story doesn't work out like that at all. And usually by the end of the semester, they're like, wait a minute, I had the wrong idea about the church, which is always a secret kind of joy to me. But in the world of the Bible, like our world, was full of migration. And the people of Israel were living in a crossroads. And so the Bible itself is full of migrants and migration. In the Old Testament, there's this word, gerim, to talk about the stranger, the resident alien, it's sometimes translated, but it essentially means immigrant. Somebody who is settled in Israel from somewhere else. And there's all these passages right there, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and to summarize the essence of them, they basically say, do not mistreat the immigrant because you were once immigrants in the land of Egypt. Like, don't forget where you came from. and which maybe is an interesting way to think about it for us living in the United States. Abraham, of course, is the biggest migrant of the early Old Testament. He travels across much of the known ancient Near East, from Mesopotamia into Syria, Palestine, Egypt. But he's also kind of a host. You see there the famous Marc Chagall painting of Abraham meeting the three angels. You remember that they start coming, and he bows down to them and provides a feast, and then at the end of their stay, they tell him that before they return, he will have a child. And it's a magnificent story about hospitality from the Old Testament, hospitality that people depended on because travel was dangerous. And also this idea which recurs through the Bible and even other literature in the ancient world that says that if you do not welcome a stranger, you're going to be in big trouble because it could be God or an angel or one of the gods. And the way this comes down into Christian theology is with the idea that the stranger is the one who brings God's message, the person who's unfamiliar to you, who's other. And that if we don't pay attention to that person, then we won't receive God's message. The other thing is that there's some wonderful virtuous migrants in the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, like Ruth or Tobit is actually one of my favorites. I love the book of Tobit because it's so wacky. Right? It's if you're not familiar with it, it has wonderful stories of a bird pooping in somebody's eyes, and so then he goes blind, and then he's healed later by an archangel, a journey to retrieve some money that ends with a man marrying someone by defeating all the demons that are trying to keep her from getting married. I mean, it's a magnificent story. But part of the thing about this strange, wacky, magical story is that the details of migration in it are awfully close to the kind of experience that people have today. Where they have difficulty adapting to a culture, where people are mean to them because they're from somewhere else, where people unexpectedly rise up and have influence in the government in their new land, where people have to go back and get some money that they left at home. All these things happen in our world just as they did in the world of Tobit. So it's a fun book, and you can see more about that in the book. There's lots of migrants and strangers in the New Testament that encounter Jesus. The early church thought of itself as people who were immigrants in the world, strangers in the world, that their real home was somewhere else. Now, of course, a lot of people talk about Romans 13 when they talk about the New Testament, where Paul says that you should obey the earthly authorities. This is a favorite sometimes of people, especially in the kind of rule of law or the law dividing good and bad immigrants narrative that I was talking about. But take a look in the book at what I do with that, because it's not that simple. And if you're going to read Romans 13, you should read Romans 12, which has a lot to do with hospitality to the stranger. But for Catholics, the biggest thing, of course, is Catholic social teaching about migration. This notion that as human beings, we're not individuals, but persons, that we are made in the image and likeness of God and have dignity that endures no matter what happens. Some of you might have seen in the New York Times recently, there was a long piece on how work is changing as a result of the pandemic. And one of the great pieces that the author made in that article was the way in which, as Americans, we tend to think that work gives you dignity. But in Catholic social teaching, you already had dignity. You don't need work to get dignity. And it's also that we are relational people, that we're connected. And part of what this does is it changes the way we think about immigrants and community. And then, of course, we all have rights and responsibilities, but not just immigrants, as I'll say in a sec, but also nations with immigrants. So to boil it down, if you can't flourish at home, you have the right to migrate in various documents of Catholic social teaching, including the U.S. Catholic bishops' teaching and the document they wrote with the Mexican bishops. Notice it doesn't say, if you can't survive, then you have the right to migrate. It says if you can't flourish, which would include things like what my doctor friend said. I felt my vocation was to teach in a medical school and I couldn't do it at home. So he has the right to migrate. This sense of that if you cannot flourish, you have the right to migrate is kind of the foundation and the sort of bedrock of all our Catholic social teaching on the subject. But there's other things too, like the integrity of immigrant families. This has an effect on a lot of things that are politically controversial in our society. So, for example, this is why Catholic teachers like the Pope and the bishops and various other people, theologians, priests, they talk about how opposed Catholic teaching is to ending family reunification as a way of entering the United States. This has been proposed at various times by various political leaders. But this has always been opposed by church leaders because of the way in which reunification allows families to stay together or to come together again. It's also why the church tends to try to lobby for immigration to be a little bit easier so that families can be reunited. And probably the main thing is it's why we're critical of deportations that are conducted inside the country by ICE, by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, because it splits up families. It's also why the church is in favor of more pathways to citizenship. We know that in the current time, the majority of undocumented immigrants have been in the United States for 15 years or more. So these are people with stable lives here, with families. And to tear apart those families is against the integrity of families in Catholic teaching. And then there's the whole thing about immigrant rights and responsibilities, right? I mentioned already about the right of a person to immigrate, but immigrants also have a responsibility to contribute and to participate. This is also why Catholic leaders lobby for immigrants to have the right to citizenship, because citizenship allows meaningful participation in ways like voting and participating in juries and various other ways in which you can participate. It's also why Catholic Charities has as one of its major efforts trying to help people gain citizenship. We also know that about 10% of undocumented immigrants actually have a legal pathway forward to residency and citizenship, but they don't know it. Lastly, nations have rights and responsibilities. So we talked about one of the rights that a nation has is to regulate its borders. But the regulation of the borders, you probably heard from people like Pope Francis, can't be one that refuses to respect the dignity of the people that are aiming to come across the border. And it's also why, he talks about bridges, not walls, right? That a wall, I think I have one. There you go. When I take my students to the border in San Diego and they look at this fence from both sides, they often ask me funny things like, is there like a scuba diving business to smuggle people? Somebody else asked me, do they check the documents of the porpoises that go back and forth? Students have a lot of fun with this. But it's also why the church is discouraging of military involvement in border regulation. The responsibilities that a nation have, this is why it's so important that policy decisions look at the needs of the so-called dreamers, right? Young people who are brought to this country at a young age but don't have legal rights to be in the country. They have been here for years. They have no other country that is theirs. The nation has a responsibility to them. And my colleague Tisha Rajendra's point that the responsibilities of a country with a long history of involvement with other countries are different. Relationships produce responsibilities. We know that from our families, from our friends, from our communities. So part of that is for those places where the United States has a strong economic, military, political involvement over the years, it's very important that we recognize that we owe those nations something because of that involvement and that relationship. Sometimes, as a nation, we have noted that. You can think of the welcoming of refugees, at least politically, from Vietnam. It wasn't always easy. As I remember in Orange County from the 70s and 80s, there was quite a bit of racist resistance as well. But there were opportunities for people to come as refugees. The same with Cuba. The same, to some extent now, finally, with Afghanistan, after so many years of the government stalling and trying to fulfill its responsibilities to a country that it had been deeply involved with, and often to people who had been deeply involved in helping the U.S. government and the U.S. military. But sometimes we're not so good at recognizing the responsibilities that come with relationships. Sometimes in Central America, all those gangs I mentioned, they are plaguing Central American countries in the Northern Triangle right now, in Guatemala, in Honduras, in El Salvador. And most of those, the rise of gangs in Central America is the direct result of deporting people accused of crimes who were immigrants, who were young men involved in those gangs here in Los Angeles and other parts of the country into Central America. It would seem like in that case, maybe we have some responsibility to the nation. We could look at Haiti. Recently, a lot of Haitians have come to our borders in Texas. The United States has occupied Haiti like 3 times through the course of the 20th century. So there are responsibilities that come from these involvements. So that's another piece, or a kind of, this is what theologians say about Catholic social teaching. So on the whole, Catholic social teaching, the Bible, the approach of our Catholic tradition is pretty pro-immigrant. My students were right in perceiving that. There are nuances. But what really gets me is sometimes, as in the case of a priest that I was interacting with, who shall remain nameless, back in Rhode Island, he was using what were basically partisan talking points to make an argument about immigration. There was no reference to the Catholic tradition, Catholic social teaching, the Bible, anything from our tradition, for which I took him to task on Facebook. But this is essentially misleading the flock, right? This is basically lying to the people. And I always remember what said in the Gospels about misleading the flock, that it would be better for those people if a millstone were thrown around their neck and they were cast into the sea. So I think we should be very, very aware of the directionality of our Catholic tradition on immigration and be careful not to fall to partisan talking points instead of mining the rich tradition that we have. So, a last word. This is not in the book, but some of my ancestors on my paternal grandmother's side came from Germany to the United States in 1870. They were Catholics from Alsace-Lorraine. And then they came to Indiana, and by the time I came along, all my grandparents were Catholic, even though only my maternal grandmother started out that way. My point is that if it weren't for immigrants, we wouldn't have much of a Catholic Church in the United States at all. And it's something to think about when we're worried about the nuns or the numbers being down after COVID. In 1800, when there were few Catholic immigrants in this country, the Catholic percentage of the population was about 0.5, 0.5%. You know, it's now still well above 20%. There were Irish immigrants, some of whom weren't even very religious, but when they came here, they became so because it was a place for them to go. Los Angeles is about 75% of its Catholics are of Latin American heritage. Some of those people are people whom the border crossed rather than crossing the border, but still a lot of them were the descendants of immigrants. And countless other communities, Filipino, Tongan, Chinese, Vietnamese, Koreans, that make up our Catholic Church here. And so just as a last kind of imaginative exercise, think about someone you know who is an immigrant who inspired your faith. My guess is it won't be hard at all. Thanks. And I forgot to mention this picture, but this is actually, it's a very sad picture. It's a cross that one of my students made that says, "God is with us." But it's from a cemetery in San Diego County, or in Imperial County, near the border, where they bury people whose remains are found trying to cross the border but are never identified. So, do we have questions, or?
Any questions here? No.
Hi, that was a wonderful talk. Thank you. I'm a recovering lawyer, so this has some legal aspect to it. We look at what the Pope said in Laudato Si about climate change, the importance of climate change. You see that even the Pentagon agrees that climate change is going to create fewer resources and basically changes in migratory behavior of human
Indeed.
beings.
Yeah.
And this is something that's known and real. If you look at something like Haiti, what happened in Haiti is not just the storm, but the failed state and the crushing of resources that they have there on the people. Your statement about our Catholic social teachings around the ability to flourish in a rapidly changing world due to the climate. A lot of the laws that we have now are laws that are designed for like another era. I mean, it's like getting a fine for your horse being tied up on the wrong spot of Wilshire Boulevard. So
Sorry, I can't hear you, so I'm going to come over here and actually listen.
Great.
This is the world of mass. I'll stand way back here.
You're good. You're good. So my question is this: is that as Catholics in our social teaching, do you think that that's where the change has to start? Is the law, or is the way to change is to change social thinking, and then social thinking will change the law, or where do you think that happens?
No, that's a good question. Thank you. Yeah, I think I want to go back on screen here. I think that it's a good question. The question is about, especially for the people at home. So especially given the way that climate change is driving migration, which is absolutely true, and Haiti is a good example. The long process of deforestation there is a major factor. It's also true in Honduras, where agriculture is becoming more and more difficult because of both weather events and also drought. And we know the weather events are made worse by climate change. You asked, in terms of trying to recognize this Catholic social teaching's call to give people a right to migrate if they cannot flourish, like, where do we begin? We begin with policy changes, or do we begin changes in the law, or do we begin with kind of, as I understand what you're saying, changing people's hearts or cultural narratives? I mean, you probably won't be surprised to learn that the answer to this is yes, I think. I have a lot of hope, actually, about the changing of cultural narratives. And I think that's because of generational changes. We see that, I mean, you never know what's going to happen in the future, but we see that young people are a lot, in part because they grew up in a very demographically different country than many of us did. When I was born in 1967, the immigrant population of the country was somewhere around between 7 and 11%, depending on where you were. It's much, much higher now. And I mean, in California, it's about 36%. And I think that because they grew up in a much more multicultural, multi-racial, multi-religious environment, they're less spooked by the changes that occur in migration. They're less nervous about the changes, how things look different and feel different. I did research in a smaller city in the Midwest, and a woman said to me, I look around, I see all these signs in Spanish, and I don't like it. I wish that my city were like it was in the 1950s. But then she said, but I might as well get used to it, and my friends also. I think young people have gotten used to it. They live in a much more multicultural world. So I think the cultural narratives, these more negative cultural narratives about immigrants, have much less of an effect on them. That's a generalization, but I think it's largely true. But the other thing is that, as we've seen, sometimes even when everybody wants something to change in the country. And the kind of plight of the dreamers is a good example, right? That pretty much majorities in both parties think that all these young people should receive a path towards legalization and citizenship. And yet, it seems to be impossible to make the change in the law for this to happen. You know, there are other things that we could talk about that are like that. In general, people are, I would say, people are more friendlier to immigration than the rhetoric of the country sometimes suggests. So I think we have to work on both. And we have a very peculiar, hyper-polarized political environment right now, which makes it very difficult to get anything done, which I'm sure is part of the story. And we've just been through a few years where anti-immigrant rhetoric has been a big part of the political debate. So I think it's going to take a while for that to work itself out, I think. Yeah. But I think we got to do both. That was maybe like a long professorial kind of answer where you cover all the bases. So does anybody else, either here or online, have questions?
It's a thank you comment. Thank you, Dr. Hoover, for the great insight. So, any other questions here? Oh.
I'm wondering if you have a theory about why there is almost this drawbridge mentality that all of these people who came to this country because they're the progeny of European immigrants imagine that they have a right to close the doors now and not let anybody else in. One of the most moving experiences of my life was meeting the young second cousins of my grandmother, and they described getting boxes of shoes that my great-grandfather had sent back to Ireland because he had made it here and he was trying to share the wealth. And I don't understand how a nation of immigrants has suddenly become so averse to immigration. So I don't know if you have a theory.
I do, yeah. I would say, I mean, it's a good point about, I think everybody heard that because you had a microphone. But I think a couple of things about that. I mean, it is curious. You know, some of it, if I can be just, you know, blunt, has to do with, you know, racial prejudice, right? At least for some percentage of the population, they're happy to welcome immigrants from places that are European or, but not so happy to places where people are black or brown. That there is a percentage of the population that just feels that way. And you know, the latest studies have suggested that in one of the reasons why they didn't have as much influence in the past was because they were distributed among the parties, right? They were both Democrat, the racists were part of the, overt racists, I should say, were part of the Democratic Party and they were part of the Republican Party. But most of those folks have migrated to the Republican Party, so they have more political influence. The other piece of it is that I think the changes in the economy figure into this, right? That especially, it's one thing for people to not do well in times when a lot of people don't do well. But now a lot of people are not doing well in times where other people are doing really, really well. And that creates tension, right, between economic classes. There's a lot of cities and different parts of this country where they used to have a robust industrial base and not much is going on there now. So a part of it, that creates this feeling like that, I mean, that contributes, I think, to some of the perceptions about immigrants as a threat, like a threat to my way of life, which is already under threat. But it's the wrong threat, right? The immigrants are not the people that are depriving those folks of the economy that they used to have. That has to do with changes in the corporate structure, the rise of the service economy, what they call the hourglass economy, where the jobs are concentrated at the top and the bottom. So I think that's a factor in it as well. There was one other thing I was going to say about that. And then I also think that some of it is just the success of I think this started with talk radio in the 80s and the 90s and has gone into some certain programs on certain television shows today, Fox News and Breitbart and places like that, where even if people don't agree with the anti-immigrant rhetoric that are involved in the programs, they see that it sells. It's exciting. It sounds dangerous. It kind of, in some ways, appeals to people's worst instincts, right? There's always a place for people to stir up people's anger, hate, resistance, right? It's always going to sell. So I think some of it is that too, and some politicians have become masterful at manipulating that message in those circuits. So I think it's a combination of all those things. It's not just one thing.
There's a comment in the chat about immigrants who do it the right way and immigrants who are undocumented as well, and that even just the challenge of the strife within immigrant communities about, I came here legally versus folks who are undocumented as well.
Sure. I think, well, there are two answers to that, right? So some of this gets caught up in our forever, in the United States, we seem to be forever having a conversation about whether the poor are virtuous or not. That we seem to always have to be assured that the people who receive any kind of help are deserving, or people that receive a visa are deserving. And which this is another thing that's in conflict with our tradition in terms of its focus on the preferential option for the poor, or the concern for the marginalized or the needy. But we have, I think, because of individualism and the way we say that we think that work confers dignity on people, like I said, rather than we have dignity to begin with. There's some of it is that we seem sometimes too worried about whether the people who receive help or visas are deserving of such. But I also think the other thing is that nobody thinks it's a good idea to come here without papers or without the legal sanction. The people that do it don't think it's a good idea. They would be much, much happier to do it in a legal way. But those legal ways are either not available to them at all, in the way I mentioned, or they're only available to them in a way that makes it almost meaningless, like if you have to wait 25 years to come. So I think, and then the last thing I would say is that there's a bit of hypocrisy, and I hear this a lot from people who have struggled as immigrants. There's a bit of hypocrisy in the sense that the economy is really set up to welcome all kinds of immigrants working in service jobs, right? There's a constant need. Most of the research in economics suggests that there are not endless people waiting for the jobs that immigrants do in the service sector in this country. There are some. And so there's this tremendous desire, and sometimes exploited by certain employers who think they can get a better deal if they hire people who are immigrants. But the immigration law is not in any way tied to the economy. So we have this incredible, this economy that needs these kind of workers, and no way for these people to receive political rights. So I think from the perspective of undocumented immigrants especially, it feels like hypocrisy, like you want us to work, but you don't want to give us any political rights. So, but I think all those people would do it legally if they could. And we've had the outcomes are very good when people receive visas and citizenship. There was a general amnesty under President Ronald Reagan in the 1980s where he signed the law that allowed a lot of people to claim residency and then citizenship, and the outcomes for those people were very good. They do better, they contribute more. So I think in a sense, it isn't ideal, it isn't good. It would be better if people could do it a different way, but often they can't, and in fact, almost always they can't. And if they, and on the other hand, if we were a little more forgiving of that, the outcomes for the country and the immigrants would be better.
Here's another question. What shall we do at the parish level to inform parishioners about the value of immigrants and the misrepresentations of who they are.
Oh, that's nice. That's nice. I mean, you have a lot of immigrants in the parish, I think. At least when I've been here, I've met a few people, a fair number of people. And I think one of the ways in which this happens is through the sharing of stories. Once I taught a class where about half of the people in the class were immigrants of one kind or another. And, they had been together for like 3 years. They were a cohort, so they knew each other and they trusted each other. And I said, well, what if people told the immigration stories of either their families or of them together? But it's, of course, even though they've been together for 3 years, most of them knew nothing about the immigration stories of their classmates. And it really changed the dynamic of the class. They were already close, but they became much closer. And about 3 people in the class who were U.S. citizens born here were so taken by the suffering that some of their friends had gone through that it kind of turned them into activists. So I think that sharing of stories, I know in some parishes they've had like dinners where people come and sit down and they combine people who are born here with immigrants at the table and they talk. Sometimes even people who don't agree politically on immigration, an opportunity to talk. Because it's one thing to say this about immigrants or this about illegals or whatever, but it's another thing to actually talk to somebody. And I recall that a student I had years ago who was gay, he went to Mass at his home parish, and the deacon was preaching, and the deacon preached a fiery sermon against homosexuality. And then my student went up to him at the end of Mass and said, I just want you to know that I'm gay. Well, you should have seen the look on that deacon's face, at least according to my student. Like he had been thinking about a category of people, but not a person standing in front of him. And to me, that is the biggest way that we change this. The suspicion of immigrants is by interaction and hearing stories. I think that, I can also think of, that's one of the reasons why I take my students to the migrant shelter in Tijuana, in TJ. Because they go there and they hear the stories of, especially of some of the men who've been deported and are now separated from their families. It's a men's shelter. They hear what they have suffered, and most of them who got deported, honestly, got deported because they were not too smart. They got in fights, they got DUIs, they were involved in other things like that. But the suffering of someone who is standing, and in some cases they were only a few, tens of miles from their families, but they couldn't see them at all. That makes an impression on people, and they learn the stories of how they came and why. They hear the stories of people who were trying to migrate to the U.S. who had left their towns in western Mexico because of organized crime. It was no longer safe for them. They heard the story, I heard a story of a Honduran immigrant whose son his kidneys were failing, and there was no government program to help that. He had no way to gather enough money to pay for a kidney transplant. So I think when we start to hear, it reminds me of what Father Greg Boyle of the Society of Jesus of my Noble University says that about poor people in general, where he says, like, if we could learn, instead of judging the poor, to listen to the burdens that they carry, we would come across as changed people. I feel like I kind of got off into a sermon there. So, anything else?
One person just commented that they appreciated your multifaceted response to those questions.
So the professor thing is working.
That's right, yeah, that's great. Are there any other questions here? No? Okay. Well, the book is available here for purchase, and for those of you online, we do have it at the Parish Center, so you can purchase it there if you would like. Thank you, Brett.
Thank you, Gil. Thank
Really
you, Father Gil.
So.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. That's why that doesn't work. Thank you all for being here. It's been a great conversation. So, thank you, Jerry.